joining us again. So you're listening to the closing arguments by Diane Menashe here, and off the top, she was talking about inference after inference after inference that the state is essentially asking the jury to make. And it seems like what she's doing here is just kind of going after every single one of those inferences. How do you think she's doing?
I think she's very effective. First off, she's obviously created rapport with the jury, even got them to giggle a little bit when she mentioned that she's not going to go through the entire amount of evidence that's sort of stacked on her desk. And she's not only establishing that the prosecution did not meet their burden of proof, but she's also poking holes in all of the things that they did try to argue, like you mentioned, the inferences that have to be made. And these inferences are not enough to really put him in the place at the crime scene, and there's no motive. I think that was a really important point that she brought up, is really, what is the motive? I think that's something that the jury's asking themselves. The lack of transparency of the evidence that the prosecution presented, only putting a few pages of text messages out there when there's stacks of text messages over the course of their relationship. Why wasn't there more of that? And even those text messages sound fairly innocuous. So really, it's a very, very effective closing argument, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, of course we know that the state is not required to prove motive, but it certainly does help the jury to kind of put the pieces together. But even this idea that it wasn't suicide, right? I mean, that's obviously the whole basis for this trial. And she's arguing that, look, if we were able to predict that people would commit suicide, then suicide wouldn't happen because then we'd intervene. And to me, it made a lot of sense. Unfortunately, I've had people in my life that I've lost through suicide, and certainly it wasn't something that we could predict. So it resonated with me. But where else do you think that she really scored some points with the jury?
The mention of the lack of transparency, creating sort of this distrust of the prosecution, not offering the bank statements. There were some bank statements that were offered showing that, she had some money, but there weren't statements that, there weren't bank statements showing that he had this $400,000 in the bank as well. So he had an inheritance. So that motive is not there. And again, like you said, the motive is not required, but that's certainly something that, everyone's asking in any situation, is why would this person do this? I think that's kind of a logical question that hasn't been answered and is probably sort of lingering in the minds of the jury.
Yeah, and really good emotion that we're seeing there from this defendant, as his attorney is actually speaking at the time about the death of his son. But certainly that has got to be beneficial for him, for the jury to see that in him. Mitra Ahouraian, thank you so much for your insight and analysis.